Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Tell Your Story. I'm your host, Todd Nesloni, the Director of Culture and Strategic Leadership at TEPSA. And each episode, I look to bring you a different guest who has encouraged, inspired, or challenged me in one way or another, and bring them on to share some of their story in hopes that it inspires you to share some of yours. I'm thrilled today for my special guest, Marisa Perez-Diaz. Thank you so much for being here. Tell everybody kind of who you are.
Hi there, Todd. Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for the invite to participate today. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm just thrilled to have a conversation with you. So again, my name is Marisa Perez-Diaz. I am the Texas State Board of Education member for District 3. So I represent the majority of Bexar County down into the Rio Grande Valley, 14 counties altogether, approximately 1.5 million people. But I always say just representing the 5.4 million students in Texas. And have been serving since, so I was elected in 2012 and have been serving since 2013 on the board. Currently serving as the vice chair for the committee on school initiatives. And so I am excited to be here, and yeah.
I love it. I love it. Well, I'm just going to jump right in, Marisa. So I love starting these conversations with, the idea of, when we're all kids, we all have dreams that we're going to be something particular when we become an adult, but we don't always become those things. And so when you were a kid, what did you envision yourself becoming?
So I love that question because it changed dramatically. So growing up, I always wanted to be a forensic pathologist. Yeah, so I probably shouldn't be sharing this out loud. My parents would be so embarrassed, but I used to love watching. There was a show on television with a forensic pathologist from San Antonio, actually from Bexar County, and he would do autopsies on murder victims and try to figure out like what happened, cause of death, those sorts of things. I always found that to be so fascinating. And I was probably like 10 years old, which is super
right.
Weird. But I just thought it was amazing. And so I'm a product of public school education all the way through. I'm currently in my doctoral studies at UTSA. So shout out to the Roadrunners. But I share that because I went to my home elementary, my home middle school, but then looked for a magnet school in health professions because I was really convinced I was going to do forensic pathology. And once I took my first bio class, like I was like, ooh, forget this. This science is not for me. Can I be a forensic pathologist without science? So, I had to deeply think about that. And it turns out I'm a much better writer than I am in science. So yeah, but I will say my experience is when I was in high school, I got to see a mastectomy as a junior in high school.
Oh.
Yeah, and open heart surgery. So it was a tremendous experience, but I learned very quickly and before thousands of dollars were wasted on medical school that it was not for me.
I love that story because it's such a reminder to me of, when we're kids, we have this vision of what these careers are that we want to be. And then when we actually find out all the stuff you have to do that career, more than just what we've seen in person or we've seen on TV, it's like, oh, I didn't realize you had to do all of that. I don't know if I want to do that side of things. And so I love that you shared that. And so when you realize that that's not the path for you, when did you decide what your next course was going to be? How did you guide into that?
Yeah. So growing up, I always knew I wanted to help people. I just didn't know it in what regard. Right. Yeah. And so it wasn't until I got to UT Austin, where I did my undergrad, that I took a social work course. Mm-hmm. And this was after several studies. So I'm the first in my family to go to college, and kind of was taking just courses because I knew I had to finish in 4 years. And that was essentially, as a first gen college student, you have to figure it out on your own. But my second year at UT, I took a social work course and fell in love with that work. I was so far into my studies that to have graduated in 4 years with a social work degree would have meant I would have had to, I wouldn't have finished in 4 years. I would have had to stay longer. And so I ended up graduating with a degree in sociology and a minor in psych, but knew that I wanted to go the social work route. So right after college, came back home to San Antonio and started working for Child Protective Services. I was there for some time and loved the work. Still, I'm very passionate about child welfare. But while I was there, I had a lot of interactions with schools as an advocate for the students on my caseload, the kiddos on my caseload. And I had one situation in particular that really was the straw that broke the camel's back for me. I was sitting in an ARD, and so it's essentially a committee hearing to decide whether or not a student's going to qualify for special education services. And so I'm in this ARD, and we're all sitting around the table, all of these advocates, just trying to figure out, this 6-year-old's future. The young man was born feral. He was born in the woods. And had no social skills whatsoever. So as a kindergartner, he's throwing chairs across the room trying to get attention. And so everybody's just trying to advocate for him. And his principal is not just asleep. She's in a full-blown snore in this meeting. Not a joke. And so I'm sure that your audience would hate to hear that.
I mean, I can't even imagine like what I would have done as the teacher in the room. Like I would have been like, are you kidding me? Like somebody's pushed them or wake them up.
I was pissed. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. I was so angry because, you have all of these people, everyone from a social worker to their teacher to their aide, just really trying to figure out how to help this student and the other 21 students that are in their class. And so to not have that support from the leadership was really upsetting. You can tell from everybody. On top of which, I was there as the advocate to support the foster parent, because the foster parent was Spanish speaking. And so I was there to help interpret, and she was upset as well. And so I walked out of there and I was like, I think I've capped out at advocating on the welfare side. There's a gap between child welfare and education. I need to be the person because I understand child welfare, and I will learn the education piece, right? I'm a public school, I experienced it myself. Yeah. And so, that just kind of, through lots of prayer, lots of conversation with friends who were working in the field, and a lot of support. I had somebody tell me, look, if you commit to the policy, we will help you through the politics of it. So I ran greener than you could ever imagine, and just through a lot of hard work, ended up winning the election that year by a landslide, and was just very lucky. So that was my journey into the board, and while I was doing that was really just, I told myself, like, if I'm gonna serve in this capacity, if I'm gonna work in education, like I really just need to completely enthrall myself in education and learn the aspects, right? And so while I decided to run for the board, I also made a career switch into education, and I imagine this is where I'm going to die, in education. I love it. I really love it. I've learned so much, and I just get to meet some really incredible people.
Well, I wanna dive back a little bit into something that is such an interest to me, is your work in the child protective system. And I had a teacher who I hired who came directly out of social work and became a teacher. And me listening to her stories was just because I, at one point in my life, thought that social work was in my path. But when I started doing the research of all that's involved, I realized that I personally wasn't able to disconnect myself emotionally enough to be able to handle the mental workload that exists with that. So I guess my question is, as a caseworker, how do you not let those extremely emotional cases like destroy you?
Oh God, it's really hard. It's really draining. What really was my saving grace is I have a really loving family, and I have a great support system and friends. So I was able to disconnect in that way, but you never really fully let it go, especially if you're committed to the kind of work that is required from a caseworker. And so to this date, I'm one of the families that I absolutely adore. I haven't been with CPS since, it's been, almost 9 years. And I still have contact with the family that I started working with back in 2008. And it's because I think part of it is it's a really hard balance, right? You have to be prepared for disappointment, which is unfortunate because as I started as a caseworker, I worked in family reunification. And so I had to work with many times the offenders of the abuse or the neglect. And in working with them, you sort of understand, that this is cyclical.
Mm-hmm.
And where do you break that cycle? And that's part of why education was so important for me, because I know it's not the answer, but it was one of those cyclical breakers, right? Like with more education, there's a potential to get out of that poverty, out of that abuse and neglect. And but it was very hard to disconnect. And partly why I needed the transition, not only because I felt like you're never going to be done in advocacy for child welfare, because there's always going to be abuse and neglect. It's unfortunate. We're seeing high spikes of it right now because of COVID-19. But I really think that it's a matter of ensuring that you're surrounded by strong people, and that quite frankly, I'll tell you, as a caseworker, somebody in CPS, you also have to learn to have a cynical sort of humor, and that's maybe not something that's popularly said publicly, but really, that's one of the survival mechanisms, I think. But I think that using cynical humor, you can also grow a little negative, and so that's when burnout starts to happen, right?
And I love that your response to this is such an honest one, because I feel like there's so many of our careers, education being one of them, that sometimes we feel like our conversations around this topic have to be so, oh no, we always keep a smile on, we always keep it together, and it's like, no, we all have coping mechanisms, because I've got another friend who worked in this, and he just said, I had to get out when I realized that even though as an organization we knew the right decision, sometimes the courts would make a different decision. And he said, it was so hard to live with myself to know that I'm putting a child somewhere that I don't believe is the right place. But the courts have said, you don't have a choice, that's where they're going. And then not knowing what's going to happen, because then the case is taken away from you. And so I've always been so intrigued by the emotional wherewithal of those that work in this position, because it was emotionally draining to be an educator. And so I can't even imagine, because to do the CPS work, you have to have a heart for kids. You have to have a heart for the work. And so it's not like you are some heartless person where the job's really easy to just dive in and do it. And so I can imagine that many caseworkers end up nearing that burnout and saying, I've got to do something else, regardless of, and having that family system is so important, and having those ways to do self-care is so important. But it's so hard for me to fathom being able to carry all that and just know that it doesn't always work out the way you want it to, despite your hardest work, the most information you brought forward, all the best intentions. And so I say thank you for your work in that, because like you said, with COVID-19 now, those cases are just spiking, and the workloads are going to be increasing for everybody when we do go back into a more normal way of things. But I think that the more we could shine a light on that, the better.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you again, very honestly, I was younger and I didn't have kids. I don't know now if my perspective would still. I don't think I'd be as empathetic, I think, for some of the families I would have to, some of the caregivers I'd have to work with. And I mean, and it's true, right? I used to look at some of my colleagues who had children and was like, oh my God, I don't know how you can do it. I'm disconnected in that way. So that was also some of the buffer that I had, I think.
I think that's a good point. And so, now you work with the Texas Education Agency, like you were saying. And so now you get to advocate. What I love is that you can tell it's a passion of yours, because no matter what kind of you've shifted to, you're advocating for people. And that was one of the things that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation, because I love that you're a perfect example of passions can change, but it doesn't mean you love something any less. And you can tell that you're in it for making things best for kids. And so, but the political world is quite different than everything else. And so, you've been in the political world now for a few years. So what do you feel like it's taught you about you?
Oh God, a ton. I think I've just personally and professionally changed a lot since I've been in this process. I think first and foremost, one of the things that one of my colleagues on the board actually has taught me is to have a short memory. And I thought that was interesting. But the State Board of Education is a partisan board. And I'm on the minority side of things. I'm a Democrat. And so having conversations sometimes when we're advocating for what's right for students sometimes tends to fall on partisan lines. And that's not the case at all, right? We're just advocating for fairness, for equity. And so I would be lying if I said that I wasn't disappointed by some of the decisions that some of my colleagues have made in the past. But you make a decision, you disagree, and then the following day you could be 110% on the same side. And so you have to be able to have conversations in a very collegial way. And I think the CPS Marisa, who was ready for a fight, has had to learn to be collegial and reserved, but without leaving behind my non-negotiables, right? Then I always have to remember that for me, number one is, are we doing what's right for all kids, not just one particular group of kids? Number two, are we being honest with ourselves, or are we being hypocritical when we're making decisions? And then number three, am I doing what would make my grandma proud at the very end of the day? So for me, that's what's important, right? Yeah. And so I think that's what's kind of helped me stay grounded in the political world, because you're absolutely right. It can be, I've seen where conversations are agenda driven and very much adult focused, right, where we're in the work of helping to provide support for our youth that are our future.
And a great question I have for you after hearing some of what you just said is, my primary base audience is educators. It's not solely educators, but it's a huge of the base that watches or listens to these. And so if they're looking to better advocate for the rights of their students or their own rights, what is your advice for their best way they can advocate?
Oh gosh, I would say first and foremost, don't be afraid to reach out to your elected officials. Where I'll speak for myself, I love to hear from practitioners, people who are actually the boots on the ground that are working. Yeah. Because I was the boots on the ground at one point, right? I was the boots on the ground when I was a caseworker, and nobody ever listened to what I needed. Right. But I knew what it felt like when policies trickled down, were interpreted a million different ways, and then I was expected to follow. So talk to your elected officials, but I would also say there are a lot of advocacy groups, and that's not specific to teacher unions. There's a lot. I can think of some here in Bexar County, like San Antonio. I think it's San Antonio Leaders Teachers, SALT. So organizations that are really helping to support the professional development of educators. I mean, those organizations, not only are they helping to grow you in your curriculum, in your just like your profession, but also in your role as a leader, because I think educators are tremendous leaders and have so much power because they have so much knowledge. But I think that the system has done so much to bog our educators down with, metrics they have to meet and, STAR preparation and those sorts of things that I think teachers just get down on themselves. Yeah. And so if there's anything I can do to remind educators that they are leaders, it would be, get out there, talk to us. I love to hear from educators, but also get involved in those organizations that support PD. Because a lot of them are now building out advocacy strands.
I think you brought up some really great points right there. The first one is, join organizations that are offering high quality PD, because a lot of them are advocating at the state and national level for educators. And by you joining them, you end up helping fund to help support them to advocate for you, because like I know, and educators are busy. And so they don't always have the time to go march at the Capitol or do things like that. But educators are the best advocates for themselves. And so I love that you said, reach out to your state and local people, do your research over who those people are. So you can send them a letter, you can give them a phone call, you can write them an email. And even when it's not bad, like even saying, you know what, I saw you did this, thank you for being here. Because I know even people in legislative type positions, they need to hear that we're happy for things that we're doing too. It's not just a complaining thing, because then good Lord, that gets annoying and then you just drown it out. And so I love your advice there. Well, Marisa, I guess, another one of the final two questions I have for you is, you've worked in positions where you have worked alongside very opinionated people. whether it's the courts, whether it's the parents that you are working with as a CPS, whether it's fellow legislative people, I mean, whatever it is, how do you not let the opinions of others take root in your own self-belief?
That's a really great question. And for me, I think establishing, again, I spoke to non-negotiables early on, right? Establishing those and making sure that I'm committed to them is what helps me. As long as I know that what I'm doing is right by students, by kids, then I think I'm on the right side of any argument, right? But I think for me, one of the most important things is I listen to opinion, but it's because it comes, right? And sometimes many times it's unsolicited. But for me, one of the most important things is to talk to people who are actually experiencing issues that pertain to the policies we're trying to pass, right? When it comes to for the State Board of Education, we're responsible for the adoption of the TEKS, and so, or the TEKS. And so I need to talk to educators who are expected to implement these standards. And if what we're doing at the state level isn't working for them in their classroom, then it's important for us to hear from them, because, once policy is passed, again, it trickles down and it's interpreted a million different ways. And what we don't want to see happen is, us, hurting again, re-traumatizing our teachers after they already have so much to do, right? Yeah. And not just our teachers. The policies that we implement also affect our counselors, our nurses, everybody, faculty and staff on campuses. And so, while opinion is fine, it's very emotionally driven. Sometimes that emotion is really, really important. But for me, a lot of what really needs to be focused in on is actual practical experience, so that when we're making decisions, it's meaningful and actionable. And so I think that's what's kind of helped me, and sometimes we hear some opinions that are very divisive, really easy to dismiss.
I love that. Well, one question I always love to end all these conversations on is, I believe as people, there are things we hold really close to our hearts and our beliefs and who we are. And so if there was one thing that you wish people would walk away with from this conversation today, what would your one thing be?
That I want to be the kind of representative that my husband and my babies, I'm gonna get emotional, that my husband and my babies would be proud of. Because I know if I'm making them proud, then everybody else can be proud of me too. But these three people are the most important people in the world to me. And so if I'm making them proud, then I know I'm doing well.
I love that. Well, I have so enjoyed this conversation today. I was thrilled when you agreed to come on. So thank you so much for not only just being open and vulnerable, but just being honest too. So thank you for joining Tell Your Story today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the invite. And I'm happy to come back anytime you need me to.
Well, thank you everybody else for listening or watching another Tell Your Story. Remember, you can check out past episodes on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, YouTube, wherever you get your stuff, it's there. I hope today's conversation with Marisa has encouraged you to get out there and tell your story, because every story matters.